Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on most of the major podcast platforms, and we encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter, The Authority File Roundup, which keeps you updated on previous, current, and upcoming Authority File episodes. You can subscribe at choice360.org by clicking on the newsletter banner at the top of the homepage. My guest for this four-part series is Rachel Friars. Rachel is a PhD student in the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I'll be speaking with Rachel about her PhD topic, Neo-Victorianism and 19th century lesbian literature and history, and how she uses primary sources to support her work. Rachel's other research interests include life writing, historical fiction, true crime, popular culture, and the Gothic. This four-part series is brought to you with support from Adam Matthew, now known as AM. In this final episode of the series, Rachel discusses how her primary source research has evolved over time, how she seeks out primary sources, and how important primary sources are for researching queer history. Okay, so I'm wondering if you could trace, sort of in your own experience, the evolution of using primary sources, and how perhaps, I don't know how long you've been doing this for, but I think you mentioned 10 years or so, but, how has this process changed for you over that time?
Yeah, I was thinking about this too, because it seems as though primary source material has always been very key to my research, but I really don't think that that's actually quite been the case. I think I came to it out of an interest in queer history and lesbian history, and it really truly started with just a basic search of did anybody exist before I did? and I think that's honestly the way a lot of young scholars
Yeah.
approach this, especially when their research is so connected to their own identity as my own is. So, it really started there, but then as I moved through, usually I would search and encounter archives through that lens. And then, of course, as I said, when I finally got into researching and thinking about Anne Lister, I began with reading transcriptions, and then I brought myself to the diaries. And that was a hugely fabulous and fun moment. It was also a moment when the diaries weren't fully digitized. So that was really, really interesting to see what was coming and what was already there. And I arrived in the middle of the transcription project, the international transcription project, to get her diaries online for everyone to see. And of course, now I feel like my relationship to archives and my work with archives has become a lot more sophisticated in the last year or so, but I still think there's further to go. And I so can't wait to spend more time with archives as I finish the dissertation project and move into other research.
Excellent. Sort of a side question that I've been meaning to ask all along is, how did Anne Lister's diaries become archived? What was it? Just her stature at the time, and like she was that of an important person, where her diaries, or any other materials that she had at the time that might have become part of an archive? But what was the sort of historical interest there?
So Anne Lister's diaries have a really interesting historiographic history, and they have a very... Sometimes when I think about it, I almost get a chill thinking about how we almost lost them, basically. So she died very suddenly abroad in 1840, and her wife at the time became sort of the steward of the diaries. And so from what I can recall, they were placed in sort of a cupboard in the Shibden Hall, the estate in the home. And they weren't really brought out until the end of the 19th century, when a descendant of hers was looking through to sort of find pieces of interest for the newspaper, like local history. And in that process, he and a friend of his deciphered the code. I believe it was "God is my hope" was the phrase, and they deciphered hope out of the symbols, and then they were able to figure out the rest of the code. Once they did that and realized what was in there, they sort of decided, okay, we need to shutter these away again, because this is not a good look for the end of the 19th century, and we don't want to be associated with any kind of queer history, literally. So they put them back. They hid them. No more transcription. So it isn't until around the middle of 19th century that they get taken up again. There's a woman who works on her letters for a period of time. The code is available now, so there's a cipher that we have, but they're still not taken up. So it's not until the 1980s or 1990s when Helena Whitbread, who is a very famous transcriber of the diaries, actually begins to spend time in those archives, begins to start working on them, and then we get her two very famous volumes of the Lister transcriptions, which were the first that I read of Lister, and the first I'm sure that many people read. And then, of course, academic interest in Lister picks up, and then with the show, I think the show cannot be credited enough for a huge surge of interest in Lister. And then we have the transcription project organized by the Archive Service, which sees her diaries being digitized all the way, but not all the way transcribed. So that's what happens there. So people are assigned pages. They're required to, pore over those and do their own transcriptions. And there's a whole process around that I find fascinating, but I won't wax on about too much. But that's in a very, very brief nutshell how her diaries come to us. And so there are, we almost didn't have them. We almost lost them, and we don't actually know what she herself intended to do with them because she died so suddenly.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you for that. So I'm wondering, kind of when you're starting a research project, what is sort of your usual approach to finding and using source materials? Like, when does that actually come into play for you?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I think it's different every time. I think I might approach an archive based on a certain author, or alternately on a certain concept or term, to see what people at the time were saying about this particular idea. So that leads me down a number of different rabbit holes. I think, I can't credit my library enough for the wealth of material that they have available for me to, hunt through various things. I think that, like any of my research projects, I just get excited about something, and I often spend like several days just reading, just consuming archives, and, really immersing myself in what's available to me before I even think about writing or arguing or like talking to an archive. But I would say that it comes into play pretty quickly after I have an idea, because you want to figure out, like, did anyone say anything about this? Did anyone, what's available in terms of secondary sources, first of all, which usually might lead me to an archive, but also what's available in the primary source context, which I think is very validating as a researcher when you have an idea and you can see it playing out in real time in someone's writing.
Right. Yeah, that's excellent. So some of your current research centers on pulp fiction, right? That's can you talk about locating and using primary sources for this? And I think there's sort of a unique approach that you mentioned earlier in a previous conversation. What makes pulp fiction particularly difficult to research in that respect?
Yeah, so my research on pulp fiction, speaking of like my idea, lightning bolt ideas, and then diving into an archive, my research on pulp fiction is definitely burgeoning and still incoming. But I have a real interest in writing on and researching lesbian pulp fiction from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, because I think that it constitutes one of the most significant periods of lesbian literary production. Of course, not all of it. In fact, probably much of it was not written by lesbians, but it has, it has a very important place in lesbian history. And so the thing about pulp fiction, and I keep, hoping not to talk about the film, I want to talk about pulp fiction, is that it's very hard to track down. It's a bit like, it's actually not a bit like, it's quite like pornography in that way. Authorship is always at issue. Are like in keeping these texts is always at issue because they're like a dime store kind of novel. And so, tracking them down and then preserving them becomes difficult. So,
why is authorship an issue? Is that just people using pen names?
Often people are writing under pen names.
Yeah.
They're writing several of these at once, or they're publishing them through various means. It just becomes a bit confused in terms of figuring out where this specific thing actually came from. And we know some things about pulp fiction, like different texts that are more famous than we do about others. But by and large, I think the things can get a little bit confused. And so it just demands a lot more attention, a lot more work. But what I find exciting is that, again, more and more collections are popping up of pulp fiction. So the Adam Matthews Sex and Sexuality Archive has this enormous collection of scanned pulp fiction texts, and they're hugely, hugely interesting. I've been through that database, and I think it's so fruitful for what I eventually want to talk about. And although there's no handwriting, obviously, they do have optical character recognition. So again, you can go into a specific text and search for words or phrases or things that you might think you want to focus on in any particular pulp fiction text. So I think that that will be enormously helpful for me later on. And it's just something I always get excited about in an archive when I see, pulp fiction available to research and view. And again, that digital stuff is important because these are, they're novels. And so it just makes the workflow easier.
Right. Excellent. So touching on Lister's diaries again for a moment, and even your work with pulp fiction, can you talk about how important archives are for researching queer history?
Yes, I think this is a great question to end on because, as I said, I think that queer people are particularly in tune or in search of queer history and queer archives and the queer past. And so archives provide that history in real time. They provide that testimony in real time. And I think testimony is a key phrase for queer people and the queer past because it implies that firsthand knowledge. So I think it's one thing to have those medical texts, and it's one thing to have, the evidence, such as it is, that queer people existed. But I think it's entirely another to have queer voices in their own words. And so, reading queer history is, I think it's a political act. I think it becomes when you search for queer lives in the past, you're demanding a political presence. You're demanding a social and archival and historical presence that is extremely necessary for, as I said, the survival and connection of the past and the survival of and connection of the present. And so I think there's a search for identity that runs through queer history, no matter when or where we're encountering those archives. And so I think what's fun about the way the databases are appearing now and the way the databases work now is that queer history and queer archives can be involved in the contemporary search for identity in a way that perhaps they weren't before. So I think that's my best answer to what I think is almost too significant to quantify in terms of how archives interact with queer history and queer scholarship.
Yeah. Well, that's a great answer. And that's all the time we have, Rachel. So thank you so much for joining us on the program. This was really fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me. I so enjoyed this.
You just heard from Rachel Friars, a PhD student in the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Adam Matthew, now known as AM. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.